Thank you, Adrian, and welcome to the second of our three-part 2016 summer series, Why It Matters, Creating and Measuring Successful Online Engagement. I'm Yemisi, the CAM specialist for the TOPS program, and I'll be hosting this event today with my colleague Adrian, who just took us through the audiovisual and housekeeping checks. We also have two more members of the TOPS knowledge management team with us in the room. They are Sheila Jackson, who is our Knowledge Management Task Force Chair and also the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist for TOPS, and also Holly Wilkins, our Communications Associate for TOPS. So we have about 21 participants online today, and it's really nice to see that some of the attendees from our first session last week are here with us again today. You're all very welcome. So before we start, let's have a very quick look at the polls that you filled in and see what your expectations are for this session. So you're eager to learn about what others know about health and engagement and how it can apply to your community. You're wondering how to continue engagement once you have started a community. Yes, I have that same problem too. Someone wants to know what a healthy community is, how to measure the success of online communities. And I think there was a comment there about wanting to know the meaning of life. I'm not quite sure if we can help you with that today, but we can try and answer all your questions about measuring online engagement. So last week we hosted community building guru Stan Garfield, who shared with us the many crucial considerations for driving community membership. And Stan also spoke about, keeping users engaged with your platforms. It was a really lively discussion. And in true KM spirit, everyone was quite willing to share their challenges and to offer any advice that they had on engagement. So a big thank you again to everyone who participated in that. If you missed last week's event, I encourage you to check out the resources on the FSNnetwork.org. There were some really practical tips that you can begin to implement immediately in your community management and online engagement work. So this week, we move on to another area which is really quite challenging for many of us, measuring online engagement. So as community managers, why is it important that we are regularly assessing our community and its different components? Where and how, for example, do we start to measure the level of engagement within our online community? And how can we actually tell or prove if and when our communities are engaged with our platforms and our content? How can we prove the value and the worth of our online engagement work? So today I have the pleasure of introducing Richard Millington to guide us through the importance and the challenges of measuring online engagement, and also to share some strategies for measuring our activities, especially going beyond a growth in numbers. So getting at that more deeper, more valuable engagement level. Richard Millington is the founder of FeverBee, a leading community consultancy that uses proven social science to develop successful online and offline communities of customers, fans, and members. He is also the author of Buzzing Communities, and it's quite a highly rated book that is widely cited as introducing best practice into developing successful online communities. Rich is a frequent speaker at online community events around the world and has helped to develop over 150 successful communities, including those for Google, the World Bank, Oracle, Amazon, the UN, and many, many more. So Rich, we're thrilled that you agreed to share your expertise with us today. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And before I hand it over, a quick reminder for our online audience. As Rich goes through his presentation, please type in any questions, any comments, any suggestions that you might have in the chat box. We will get to these questions during the Q&A segment after Richard's presentation. But please feel free also to use the chat box to share any experiences you have with measuring online engagement. This is an area that many of us struggle with, so let's try and keep the discourse going and share our various approaches with each other. And with that, over to you, Rich.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Okay, give me 1 second. Let me share my screen and make sure this all works okay. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? Can I just get a quick verbal check on that?
Yes, we can hear you fine, I think.
And can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. Whenever I do a presentation like this, I can always feel the burning excitement from people every morning to learn about the data behind their online community. But in all seriousness, data is such a critical component of what we do. It's like imagining a government that doesn't collect any data on what its citizens are doing, no censuses, nothing like that. They would have no idea where to focus their time, where to focus their efforts, and whether what they're doing is even working. And the very same thing is true for us. What we've been finding over the last 5 to 10 years is that we can optimize almost every single thing that we do just by understanding the data much better. By understanding not just what data we need to collect, but most importantly, how we use that data. What we find so often is that we get really into, what data should we collect? What metrics matter? I mean, is it Google Analytics? Is it this tool? Is it that tool? But we don't think about how we're going to use that data. For example, if the level of activity went down or up in your community tomorrow, what would you do differently? What would you do differently if the activity was down or up? And this is why it matters. We have to figure out what that decision tree looks like. How we're going to use that data. Instead of just presenting it to our bosses or the other stakeholders we have, how we're going to use that data is far more important than what data we actually collect. So let me take you through some of the things that we've been noticing on the what we call data-driven community management side. So there's a couple of things that I want to walk you through today. The first one are outcomes. I know most people here are probably working in the non-profit space, the government sector, or things like that. So I'm not going to spend so much time on the business side, in things like customer retention, things like customer loyalty or innovation. I'm not going to spend so much time on that. I'm going to focus on really specific outcomes that a organization gets from a community, and most importantly, how we can measure those outcomes. Second, we're going to look at the life cycle of a community. What we find is that almost every kind of group, almost every kind of community goes through the same kind of life cycle. And third, we're going to look at the tactics behind communities. Everyone loves tactics. And we're going to look at what kind of things we can measure and how we can use the things that we're measuring to optimize the activities that we're doing. So let's begin with the outcomes first. What we look at when it comes to the outcome side is how we set the objectives, how we get the stakeholders aligned, and how we set up the systems really early to get the kind of data that we need. So when we're setting objectives, the key critical thing, and I don't think this will surprise anyone listening today, or at least I hope it doesn't, is that the whole purpose of developing a community is to change the behavior of a group of people for a sustained period of time. If they're already doing that behavior today, then there's no reason to build a community. So the whole purpose of building a community is to change behavior, whether that is changing how people share information with each other, whether it's how you're documenting information and getting people to document it in a different way, whether that is capacity building in some context. Communities are designed to change behavior. And the very first thing before anything else that we always need to get in place is deciding what behavior we're going to change. And that usually means looking at what people are doing now and what we want them to be doing next. One of the toughest strategy decisions that you're going to face when you're developing any kind of community is how big of a gap that's going to be. So for example, if the gap between what people are doing now and what you want them to be doing isn't that great, it's going to be far more likely that you will succeed in that strategy. However, you're not creating that much value because the behavior hasn't changed much. However, if you're trying to get people to do things that is radically different from what they've done before, there is huge value there. But the downside is that it's going to be far harder to achieve that. So you have to figure out along that continuum there how you're going to set that objective. And what we try to do is make sure that we link the behavior to specific actions that we want members to perform. If we are going to be documenting information, if we're going to be sharing information, if we're going to be looking at any kind of objectives, we need to link it to very specific actions that members are going to perform. And I'll come to that in just a second. And the third thing, and this is the other really critical part here, is that a community should achieve the objectives either faster, cheaper, or more effectively than any other method that is out there. If it doesn't, then why build a community? Why not use a different method instead? So this is what we're looking at. So here's what I mean. What we have with a lot of our clients is a big chart showing all different types of value, and a lot of it is a business value instead. But if we look at typical outcomes here, say if you want members to be more informed, think about what specifically a member would have to do to be more informed. And this isn't that difficult. They would have to ask questions. They would have to share information with each other. They'd have to search for information. They'd have to read relevant information as well. And if that's the outcome that you want, now you know the kind of things you have to measure. So it's a very simple connection. If you're working for some sort of social return or social impact in some form, then you might be looking at, the improved welfare of your members. So how do you improve the welfare of members? Well, in some categories, that might be asking emotive questions. That might be asking for help. That might be giving help and emotional support. If you're looking at the capacity, you might be surveying your members and finding out whether they feel capable to perform their role, whether they feel they can do what they're supposed to be doing in the future. So you know far more about this side than what I do. But the key thing I want to be really careful here is that we're linking the outcome we want to very specific actions that members have to take to achieve the outcome. I know how obvious this sounds, but it gets forgotten so many times. So we don't want that to happen here. So these are the kinds of things that we measure. If that's the outcome we want, we measure the things on the right-hand side here. And this is not a definitive list by any means whatsoever, but it gives you a kind of idea of the things that you can measure. The second step is the stakeholder alignment side. It's really important that we get stakeholders aligned with what we're trying to achieve. Very recently, a friend of mine who runs one of the best online communities I've ever seen lost her job. And not only that, her entire team working in that community team lost their jobs as well. And it's not because they didn't do a good job. They did a fantastic job. But ultimately, the stakeholders in the organization were not convinced of the value. They didn't see the value, and when it came to making the tough decisions, when it came to cutting the budget of the organization, the community was the first thing on the chopping block. And this happens incredibly often. So we have to get the stakeholders involved in really specifically mapping how the community helps them. One of the things we do as part of our course is get every single participant to speak to every relevant stakeholder they can find within the organization and map out exactly how the community can help them. They get their input, they build those relationships, and they make sure that there's a clear connection there. And that boils down through to the objectives as well. If we go to our boss, if we go to our boss's boss, if we go to other stakeholders within the organization and ask, what metrics would you like to see? They will very quickly give you a list. And the other important thing here is that raw data alone is not very persuasive. I don't know if 500 members participating in my community is good or bad, but I do know that 500 is better than the 300 it was the month before. I do know that having, say, one in every top 4 of the experts in my field sounds much better. I do know if we have, the best people in our field participating. So providing context to the metrics is often more important when you're communicating to the stakeholders within the organization. And we also be looking at things like how we collect anecdotal data as well. It's going to be impressive. We know most people are far more persuaded by their emotions than by facts. And we've seen this happen so often when someone working in communities will present all the data, but it's not very persuasive. And that's why we also want to share news whenever the community hits a major milestone. That might be your 100th discussion, that might be the 500 member that's joined, the 300th article that's being shared. Whatever milestone you can share is usually a good idea to share it because it helps form the opinions of people. One of the things that happens so often is that most people don't try to persuade their boss or the stakeholders within the organization. about the value of the community until they're asked about it. But they'll only be asked about the value when the stakeholders aren't sure of it. And by that point, it's going to be very hard to change the opinions. So you want to shape the opinions before they are formed. I hope that makes sense. So like I said, speak to and map out the outcomes to stakeholder needs. Find out what they want. And then set up the systems really early. There's a lot of things that you can measure that really aren't that important. And the things that are important, whether members have changed their behavior in some particular way, usually are much harder to measure. So you can measure the things on the right. You can run a survey now of your members. You can run a survey later on. So you can get exactly the kind of data that you need, but you have to set up the systems before you need it. Because you can't compare, say, a before and after survey of your members if you didn't do the before one. So if you haven't done this yet, make sure that you're benchmarking where you are now, because in a couple of months' time, I guarantee you that you're going to need it. And here's the other thing, is that the data should inform and guide the strategy of the organization. The way that we tend to put a strategy together is a lot like this. There are 4 categories here. First, there's strategies that target existing members that are performing the behavior you want already. So by this I mean, if members are already doing what you want them to do, and if you have enough members that are in that community, if you have a high penetration rate of people that you're reaching within that field, then you don't need to do a massive promotional campaign. What you want to do is engage in a strategy that's going to increase the frequency of people visiting the community, increase the duration, the amount of time that they spend participating in that community, or increase the quality of the behaviors, the value behaviors that you want. On the bottom left, if you have your existing members that are actively participating in that community, but they're not doing what you want, and I know how infuriating this can be because we've been there so many times, your strategy isn't to continue growing the community. Your strategy is to change the behavior of members. And that's going to mean changing their attitudes. That's going to be maybe changing the social norms of that community. That might mean changing the environment to make that behavior you want easier to perform. But this is where tracking data is so important, because the data is going to tell you what kind of strategy you need to use. If you have people that are performing the behavior that you want, but you don't really have enough members in that community, then well, that's clearly a growth strategy you need to use. You need to be promoting the community. You need to be targeting the right kinds of people within that organization. So it's really clear and really specific. But here's the thing, you just have to make sure you know which of these you're going to use and why you're going to use it. So your data should definitely be informing this. It should definitely be deciding what strategy you use. Very often we think of strategy as some creative spark of genius process, and that's not the case. It's simply the act of following the data you have right now to get to the right decision. So the key questions I'll be looking at here is, are members performing the behavior that you want already? And question number 2, are enough members performing that behavior you want? And by enough, your interpretation that can vary. I know everyone always wants more, but having more members doesn't always mean you get more of the behavior you want. It can equally have the opposite effect as the culture is lost and all those kinds of things. Next, we look at the life cycle of a community. I don't know if you've had a chance to read my book. If you haven't, please buy copies and for your friends and as Christmas gifts, that'd be fantastic. But what we spend a lot of time talking about is the life cycle that a community goes through. And the life cycle is very much like, the life cycle is very much about how a community grows and develops over the course of since its creation. So it looks very much like this. So let me quickly talk you through this. In the very early stages, when you're just launching a community, you're in the inception stage of the life cycle. So the rate of growth, that is the number of new members that are joining your community, is actually really low. These will be the founding members of your community. And by the way, we found it's a lot easier to get people to join a community if you call them founding members than it is to ask them to join a new community. So here we look at things, how we give members a sense of exclusivity and influence over that field. But then as you grow and develop, you move into the establishment phase of that community life cycle. Here's usually where you get people more interested in the topic itself. And here we're looking at how we get the concept, the idea of that community more closely aligned with their unique interests. Third, you reach that maturity stage. This is where you get to the point where the rate of growth, which is the number of new members that are joining in each month, peaks. It's not the level of activity that peaks, it's the number of new members that join each month that peaks. And here we're looking at things, how we provide tangible value to members. And then once you've peaked, there's that saturation phase where you need more momentum. And finally, what is known as the mitosis phase. This phase is important because every community will reach a point where it cannot grow any faster. There simply aren't enough people out there anymore. So at this kind of stage, we look to see how we can have a sustainable rate of growth, which is how you keep having new members that are joining to replace the ones that you inevitably lose. And this is why it matters, because where you are on the life cycle should dictate the kinds of tactics that you will decide to use. So if we go back to the life cycle again here, in the first, usually around 0 to 6 months, but it varies wildly, what we look to see most importantly is the level of organic growth and the level of organic activity. We're not talking about plants, we're talking about how much of the growth comes from members themselves and how much is facilitated by you. This might be a little bit different if you run an internal online community, but the principle is still relatively the same. So organic growth would be people that heard about the community through friends, through acquaintances in that field, or just heard about it but weren't directly invited by you. When you reach more than 50%, that's the critical mass point. That's a point where your community is going to continue to grow and develop by itself at an increasingly faster rate. And that's the key point here, reaching that critical mass. And the same is true with organic activity. There's going to be activity in the community, especially in the very early stages where there isn't much there yet, that is entirely generated by you. And you know what it's like. That's you that's initiating the discussions. It's you that's responding to the discussions. It's you that's going to be prompting people to participate. But what you're going to see is that eventually members should start performing those actions. And if they don't, this tells you where to focus your time. If you look at the bottom, the key tasks that we have there, these change over time as your community grows and develops. Then as you move into the establishment phase of the life cycle, what you spend your time doing will usually evolve as well. Perhaps not resolving conflicts for the audience here, but definitely in terms of building a stronger sense of community among members, organizing more activities, writing content for that audience. And this usually takes between 6 to 12 months, but it varies a bit. And this is usually from the phase where 50 to 90% of growth is generated by the community, as in comes from the community, and 50 to 90% of activity comes via the community as well. And I'll tell you how we measure that in a second. And then as you can see in the maturity stage, we look at the 90 to 99% and the activities change again. Then finally in the mitosis stage where your rate of growth peaks, the community begins to split up, you have smaller subgroups, but this will only really affect the really largest online communities that are out there. So how do we measure this? And by the way, I just want to point out again, it's so important that our tasks do change here. So once we're gradually evolving from one stage to the next, that our work changes as well. If you're still doing the same task that you did a year ago, something hasn't quite worked out here. So how do we measure these things? How do we get the exact data that we need? The bad news is that you probably can't get this data from Google Analytics. That's the bad news. The good news is that it doesn't take you that much time or that much effort. So for growth, the kind of things that we look at are the number of active members in the community, which is people that have made one contribution within the previous 30 days. This you usually can pull from the platform itself. And the second one is the percentage of members from organic sources in the community. Most people, they make a mistake, they try to track where every single member came from. That's not the right way of going about this. What you do want to be doing is running a sample of your members. Say if you had 50 people that joined in the last month, do a sample of 10 if that's what you can do, 20, 30, as many as you can do, and sampling where they came from and then multiplying it by that percentage there. That's what we want to be looking at. What percentage of them came from an organic source? So it's not going to be specific, but it's going to be relatively useful and accurate for you. When it comes to activity, the kind of things we look at are the total number of contributions. So you can usually pull that from whatever database you're using, or just count the number of contributions that you have in 1 week and then multiply it by the number of weeks. We want to be looking at the number of contributions per active member. This will usually be the total number of contributions that is being posted in the community divided by the number of members who have made a contribution. If you can't do that, then divide it by the number of users that visit your community over that month. So this isn't exactly the same thing, but it will tell you if things are going the right way or the wrong way. And third, like I said, we want to measure the percentage of posts on topics initiated by members. So if you initiate a discussion and you have 5 responses, we don't count that because it's not sustainable for you to initiate every single discussion yourself. What we might want to do here, if we can't do this in an automated way, is again, we do a sample. We look at a sample of the posts and discussions that have been posted there. We look at the average number of responses, and then we multiply as a result. And we have a fairly good idea what percentage of posts are organic and which aren't. So again, you can't easily pull this data from Google Analytics, but that's the difference between measuring what's easy and measuring what's important. So what we use on the feedbeat.com site, for example, you can track the kind of things we measure here, the number of new members, we track the newcomer to registered member conversion rate, how many newcomers make a contribution, how many new members made their first contribution to the community. We look at the percentage of newcomers who make a contribution. And this is important because it tells us, are people joining? Actually, we'll come to this later on, but it tells us if people are joining the community, if they're liking the community, if they're sticking around. These kinds of things are really important. And then on the other side, we look at the total number of members, total number of posts. We removed the data from the community manager, my colleague Sarah Hawk. We removed her data from this because obviously she's going to post like 10 times as many as any other member. So we have a relatively good idea how active our members are, how engaged they are, whether they're liking the content as a result. To measure the sense of community, and this is a really important thing as well, because sense of community is highly predictive of generating a positive return on investment and highly, highly predictive of retention rates. So we use a survey here called the Sense of Community Index, SCI2. You can Google it, or maybe one of the moderators here can post a link to it. We use an adapted version of this, and we apply it to an online community. And we do this on usually every 6 months or so, and we try to get an idea whether the sense of community is going up or whether it's going down. And then finally, the overall value gained. This is usually the net benefits that we're measuring, the outcomes that we're measuring, compared with other methods of achieving the same outcome. This is kind of complicated to explain, but I think everyone here will probably have an idea what I mean, which is it's not enough to highlight the value that was created by the community. You have to highlight it in respect to other ways of achieving the same value. So for example, it's impossible to measure the value of a community getting together, protesting against a power plant being built in the local area. But we can measure the cost it takes to get names on a petition. We can measure things like that and compare it against to other methods, someone going out there and collecting names on a petition. So we can measure things, but we want to make it relative to other methods of achieving the same value here. And finally, I think we're way ahead of schedule actually. Finally, we focus on the tactics side. Everyone loves talking about the tactical side of this. So by tactics, what we do is that community management can essentially be broken down into a couple of really specific things. These are things that most community professionals today are working on. One is the strategy side. This means collecting data, identifying what the goals are, and putting together a strategy and communicating that strategy. Second is growth, which is getting more people to join that community and then converting them into active members. Third is creating content for the community, both in terms of information and content about the community. Fourth is initiating events and activities, webinars, and all those kinds of things. Fifth is the influence side. This is how you personally participate to gain influence within that community. Next is the motivation side, such as initiating discussions, removing discussions, and changing things around like that. Next is the user experience side. So the user experience is everything to do with the technology. And finally, we have the internal side. All those meetings you have to explain the value of the work you do, all that internal coordination, this all falls under this category here. So we want to figure out how can we use data to try and optimize as many of these as possible. I'm not going to go through every one because I don't think we have time, but I'm going to go through a few of the really critical ones. So when it comes to the strategy side, yes, we can measure it. Is it signed off by the senior stakeholders within the organization? Is it understood and supported by the colleagues that you work with? Is there a clear agreement? Is there signatures? Is there a quantifiable way of knowing that they support the strategy? Is it linked directly to a change in tactics? Does it allocate your time and resources accordingly? So very often a strategy will be created, but there'll be no change in how resources, time, or anything like that is allocated as a result. And finally, of course, the visible increase in whatever metrics are being tracked. If everything else goes well, this is what you get. You should see a visible improvement over the lifespan of that strategy. Growth is much easier to track. So we look at things, so here we look at a funnel of growth really, which is first we look at the increase in unique new visitors to the community. So in Google Analytics, if you pull the number of users to a community each month, you multiply it by the percentage of them that are new. So this tells you how many people are visiting your community for the very first time. This is a really important figure to track. This tells you whether your promotional efforts are working or not. If this number is going down, then you're eventually going to dry up. So you have to spend more time promoting the community, either directly at a one-to-one or in emails or whatever system that you use. Next, we look at how many people that visit the community actually sign up to that community. This is a very simple conversion rate. We take that number of unique new visitors, we contrast it or compare it with the people that joined or registered for that community that specific month, and then we get a really simple conversion rate here. If this isn't going well, then we look at changing what's on that front page when people visit. We change the copy, we change the registration page, we tweak these kinds of things. Next, we look at the number of registered members who join that month that actually participate. So how do we measure this? Because no platform actually lets you do it. Well, we don't. We don't overthink this. We do a sample of, say, the last 10 members, last 100 members, whatever we can do, and we track how many of them actually made a contribution, and then we generalize that across the entire number that actually joined that entire month. If this isn't going well, it says that while they find the concept of the community interesting, they're not finding a specific thing that they want to do. And finally, we look at the number of members that stay active for 3 months. So we take a sample of members and we track them and track how long they stay actively participating for. On some platforms, you can develop great systems that will do all this on your behalf. It's more likely you're going to be individually counting things at times. Now, I'm fully aware that that takes time and it's frustrating and it's annoying and it's going to be hell on any of the staff or the junior team that you have working for you that I hope you delegate this task to. But it's really important because it's going to save you so much time. The whole point of doing this is with every single action that you take is to be laser focused on what's going to have the biggest impact. Because I know a lot of people don't have time to manage the community as a full-time job. This helps you make the best use of your time. Next, we look at the content side. So for content, we look at very specific things, but it depends on the strategy a bit. So is it changing the attitude of members in that community? So we measure the attitude change. Is it increasing the average time on site? So we measure the average time that is spent on each item of content out there, and we try and track things in that way to measure what content is the most popular, etc., etc. Is it being shared and bringing in more members? Social channels might not be such a big thing for you, but it will be something like this. And finally, is it building a stronger sense of community? If it's content about the community, and by the way, we always find that best content for a community is content about the community, then this is where it will show up. So are members more familiar? Could they recognize more members by name? And that's a very specific question on the sense of community index. Next, we look at events and activities. So the really important thing of running events and activities is to get people to visit the community more often. That's simply the key reason for it. And that means you have to do things that are interesting. So the key metric to track is it increasing the frequency of visits? And you can track that in Google Analytics, how many times people visit each month. We then want to track, are the events popular with a large group of members? So if you run a discussion or an activity, what happens very often is that a tiny group of your members will absolutely love it. And they'll go crazy participating, they'll really enjoy it. But what happens is that everyone else feels left out. Everyone else doesn't feel as engaged in the community anymore. So we want to track whether it's popular with a large group of members in that community. And that's the total number of people that are participating, not the number of unique actions here. And finally, we want to track, is it making the community sticky? As in, are people coming and they're starting to visit every single day? So here we divide the daily active users in that community by the monthly active users. This will tell you how many days or how many members are participating for how many days in that community. Next, we look at the moderation side. And by moderation, we include things such as initiating discussions and responding to discussions and those kinds of things. Discussions are going to be the critical part of what you do. If you initiate the right discussions, you're going to get great information that's being shared and all those kinds of wonderful things. So here we look at, again, total number of members that are participating in discussions. We look at whether members are initiating their own discussions, like we said. And we also look at things like, are they sharing valuable information? So for example, we know that off-topic discussions can be great at increasing the total quantity of participation within that community. But we want to track how many discussions are featuring useful knowledge exchange. We don't track the percentage because that's not so relevant for us. We track the total number of discussions where useful knowledge is exchanged, and the only way to track this is to tag it. Do a sample of the discussions again if you want to, but just get a good idea of what's going on here. So that's a quick overview of the data that we track here. What you can do if you want to learn more is that we put together a whole video package here. It's completely free at getvideos.freewheel.com. And this will give you access to everything around 60, I just lost the slides, 60 free videos from experts in that field. But with data, it's very much a case of the data that you need, you're going to have to hunt around to get. Because Google Analytics isn't really designed for online communities. Very few data packages are. So we want to be tracking the things that matter, the things that indicate that the community is achieving the outcomes that it wants. And that might be a survey method that we use. We want to be tracking where the community is in the life cycle, because this tells us what we need to spend our time doing, which of the key tasks we need to spend our time doing. And once we've done that, we look to see how we optimize those specific tasks. Because we have to use the limited time we have as effectively as we possibly can. I hope you found this really useful. I'm not sure how you want to take the questions now, but I'll stick around and just let me know.
Great, thanks, Rich. That was really, really sort of interesting. I have to tell you, I'm a huge fan of your data-driven approach and the way you kind of promote basing your community management strategies and activities on an evidence-based perspective, rather than just assuming you're hitting the right notes with the things that you choose to focus on or the things that you're required to focus on. We have a lot of questions coming in. The first one, is, I think, is a follow-up from something you just said. How do you define useful knowledge exchange?
Yeah, I mean, this will vary depending upon the kind of organization you work with and the kind of knowledge that you want and whatever the outcome is. So one way of looking at it would be tagging each discussion where you think a useful item of knowledge has been shared, but that's not really an outcome, I don't think. So we look at more how that knowledge is being used, how many people are using that knowledge. Is it helping, do people that are using that knowledge or have access to that community feel they are better equipped to use that kind of information? Do they feel that they are better at their jobs? So a survey method might be really useful here. incidents of whatever you want to see. So for example, if people are being more effective at their roles, there should be some visible metrics that you can track related to that. It could be the number of articles that are documented within a knowledge base. So it varies so much depending upon the kind of organization you work with. We do a lot of work with the World Bank, for example, and we know that their methods, vary very much with the kind of department that they're working with. So I don't have a specific answer to that, but there are different methods that you can use. If you want to give some more context later on, then just drop me a line and I'll help as best I can.
And I think that goes back to your advice to kind of set your specific objectives, set those your activities and your indicators are speaking to those objectives.
Very much so. I mean, the first thing is to decide what behavior that you're trying to change, then figure out how you know if that behavior has changed. So what visible thing would you see? And then you look for a way that you can either track that quite directly, or whatever that proxy metric might be, a metric that would reflect the thing that you can't really track itself. So those are the kind of things that we'd be doing at the beginning. So if that knowledge is being exchanged, what would you expect to see? What would people be doing differently as a result? And how would that show up in any kind of metrics?
Great. Next one, Adrian.
And this actually relates to the question that I had in my mind, but I think it was Wendy that asked, how do we, in terms of quiet observers, or AKA the lurkers in our online communities, how do we quantify their impact, or do we at all?
I think this is one of those ones that depends very much upon the objective itself. So lurkers, whatever term we want to give them, they can be useful in that they can share information with each other. They might be useful that they consume and they use the information, therefore the organization is having an impact upon them. So there's a couple of important things here. The first one is that if you are doing a survey of people in your community, is to make sure that the survey reflects the makeup of that community. So what happens very often, someone will do a survey of their members and the most active members will participate, but they will only make up, say, 10% of the people that visit that group. So that's a kind of issue we have, because we need to get results and the survey responses from the lurkers, the people that visit but don't usually participate. That's usually using a quota system. You can look that up and some of you will know way more than I do. But generally you want to have a quota system that reflects the community. So that's how you collect the behavior change in what they're doing, or the change in their attitude, or whatever it is that you tend to measure. Lurkers themselves aren't so useful in terms of the health of a community, but they can contribute to the value the community has generated, and they can show up in those kinds of metrics.
Great, and I also have quite an interesting one from Joan Jennings from TOPS, and this is one of my challenges in-house as well. So if you haven't taken a survey at the start, is it possible to do a retrospective survey and ask people to reflect upon what they've gained since the start, so since their membership and things like that? How would you go about establishing some kind of comparative baseline if you haven't done that at the start?
Sure, and again, it depends very much on the objective itself. Sure, you can do that, but people are, I mean, the problem with any survey whatsoever is that people lie, or it's not always that they lie, it's that they don't remember, like what the most famous one I can think of is, how much food people eat. And everyone is wildly off about the number of calories that they think they consume. So trying to ask people what they ate, say, 1 year ago would be extremely difficult. So I wouldn't worry so much about that. I would worry about today. I would benchmark the behavior of your new members today. So for example, and I'm using the calorie thing as an example. Say your community is designed to reduce or help weight loss. I would track when people join the community after they would participate in a survey, and an anonymous survey, of course. Ask them to just track their eating habits over one day, not what they usually eat, but things that they can track that's really recent in their mind. And then you can compare that again to results from 6 months later or a year later, so you know how much change it had upon one person. Then you can look at multiplying that by the number of active members within that community. And it's not going to be specific, but it's going to give you a fairly good idea of what kind of impact that community has. It's more complicated than that in reality, and we can talk more about that if you like, but that's a very basic principle here.
Wendy actually has a third question. She asked, so when requesting the data, I guess, like, how do you determine the optimal time to request the data, as change takes time? So from when you send out the survey and then you create action items to the online community, when do you determine to analyze the data, I think, with the under and overestimation based on social cues and perceptions of helping the cause?
Sure. So we usually use 6 months to a year, but you can, I mean, this is one of those places where I think the audience knows best of how long a change is likely to take. And there's no reason why you have to stop tracking after, say, 1 year if you do a survey again a year later. I mean, there's a huge amount that you can read on research methods and things like that. And it's worth reading as well if you want really accurate results. But I would at least track it once a year and then continue tracking it every year. So what you can do, for example, if you take the people that join over the next month and call them cohort A, and then the people that join a month later, call them cohort B, and you just, or so on and so on. You can track the changes by each cohort over a sustained period of time. You know, if they reduce the amount that they eat or the amount of knowledge that they share as a result of participating in that community, you can attribute that to each cohort. You can attribute that to the amount of time they're spending in the community, and you can keep tracking that year on year. I mean, one survey a year is a very reasonable thing to ask. And you also get to see things like the churn rate. So not everyone that joins your community is going to stay actively participating in that community forever. In fact, you know, 70, 80% of them will churn through the year. So you can track that, and you can incorporate that into your methods as well. After this, if you like, I can share a spreadsheet that we use for a lot of the methods that we put together, but it's quite a very complicated thing, so you can adapt it to your own needs.
Thanks, Rich. And I think I'll definitely take you up on that offer of spreadsheet at least, and we'll share it out on the FSN network as well. Another question, what is the average time frame it takes for a community to mature? Abby, for to know, are in-person communities different in terms of life cycle length and maturity?
Can you repeat the question there? You cut out for a second.
Of course. So what is the average time frame it takes for a community to mature? And then following on to that, in terms of life cycle length and maturity, are in-person communities different from online communities?
Yes, but they're also less predictable. Online communities typically follow the same kind of process, and it can vary really wildly as well. But we typically see, you know, 0 to 6 months to reach that critical mass stage, and then 6+ months to get to the inception stage, to get to the establishment stage, etc. And the important thing is also not to rush this. Like, it's really tempting to have a big launch and get everyone to join, but you're not ready for that yet. If you're just launching the community today, then you want to grow really slowly, make sure you get the concept right, make sure you know how to convert a newcomer into a regular member of that community. For an in-person community, or an in-person group, you can go through all these stages in like a single day. I mean, it's crazy at times. What I mean is that the level of interaction is so much quicker as a result. People can build a much stronger sense of community as a result. So yeah, it can be much quicker, but it's harder to predict. I mean, in the real world, I mean, people that are a community organizer might spend years building a community together. So I don't have a set answer other than it can be much quicker or it can be much slower.
And also, when communities are split among different platforms or media, how do you determine success? How does measuring health of your platform vary between different platforms?
Sure, we don't usually see this happen that often. Actually, I can't think of a single time that we've had to track this. But what we would probably do is use the same process, really. How much of the growth is generated by members compared to by the community manager? How much of the activity is generated by members compared to the community manager? And either combine the platforms or weight the importance of the platforms to get some sort of total figure there. I think it's going to be quite a specific case, and usually we try not to spread a community out over multiple platforms just because it gets quite messy and it detracts, and neither one is ideal.
Okay, and a quick question. This is, I think, moving slightly away from measurement, which is fine, from Christy from Thoughts. People often say they don't have time to participate, and we often look for ways to make it easier and more efficient for people to participate. At the same time, we're seeking to help people find tools that help them do their work more efficiently. Do you have recommendations on how to make the most of someone's time? While people may look, they may not contribute because of the time investment. So how can we kind of draw them into this participation journey?
Sure.
And that for me is a tricky, yeah, that's tricky for me as well on the FSN network. How do you kind of get at that personal motivation for contribution? Thanks for that, Christy.
It's funny, every organization that we work with, they always tell us the same thing. They'll say, our organization is really unique and it's really hard to build a community here because our members don't have time. I mean, this is pretty much the rule for almost every single organization that we work with. And the truth is, as most of us know, it's not about time. I mean, it's not about time. So few people go to work exactly or leave work exactly on time. They'll stay until the important work is done. The problem with communities, or as far as communities are concerned, is that it isn't to make or reduce the time it takes to participate. That can help, but it's not going to have that much of an impact. You're going to spend a lot of time doing something that doesn't have much impact. The critical thing is that people don't see the value. It's not a priority for them. And it's not a priority for them because it doesn't help people achieve their particular needs. So this usually means that they participated once and didn't get a good response, so they're not going to participate again. It usually means that when they join the community, they can't see anything that they can immediately use right now. So the community isn't that relevant to the task that they have. It might mean that they don't really know the other people in that group, so there isn't a strong sense of community. It might mean that their ego isn't invested in that group. They don't feel the need to impress the other people in that group. And this is usually the kind of things that we make time for. So your challenge isn't to make it easier to participate, but to change the perception of that community. And this is something that we've probably had more experience with than anything else that we've talked about, really. Because this happens with every single online community, which is members say they don't have time. And of course they don't. I mean, no one has a spare time just sitting around where they're staring at the wall. So a couple of things really help. One is to figure out what activity the community is supposed to replace. So if you want people to participate in a community, it has to help them do something better or quicker or more efficiently than what they're doing it today. And if it does, then you'll be surprised to find that's where the time comes from. So you have to cut time. There's a balance here. And you have to balance out where that time is going to come from. To find out what the community will help your members do better. And if the answer is nothing, well, there's a big challenge there in getting people to participate. The second one is making sure when people do visit that there's something very relevant to them right now. So if you were to interview your members today and ask them what their biggest challenges were, what did they want to accomplish in their career, and most importantly, the best question that we've found is, what are you struggling with this week? And then create discussions about that, create content about that, help solve those challenges right now. People will find the time to participate because it immediately helps them right now. It's a highly relevant community for them. If you build a stronger sense of community where it becomes more of a group of peers, people will find the time to participate because that's where their friends are. That's what they want to spend time doing. This might be a little less relevant for the audience here, but I've seen it happen in a lot of government organizations. I used to work for the UN, and I've seen it happen. So it's never a time issue. I mean, there are communities for lawyers, doctors, teachers, every single field. It's not about time, it's about the priority and the perception of that community. And we have to change that. We have to make sure that the community is very relevant to what people are doing today. So how can your community help people save time today? And by the way, if people say that they don't have time to participate, one of the best things you can use is simply to take that and explain how the community can save them time. And that might mean save them time looking for information, looking for experts, filtering information, getting replies to their questions, etc. But it has to be these kind of things that we're trying to tackle, not a case of, or hopefully not a case of making the behavior as easy as possible, because all you're going to get going down that route is behavior that isn't as valuable to you. Someone clicking like instead of commenting and giving their feedback on a discussion is not good for us. I mean, I don't think it's good for the community. So yeah, I think I got quite passionate about that response, but I hope that helps.
Yes, you did. Thank you. And it sounds like we really need to be a bit more intentional about making sure these activities that we do are demand-driven and that we're first of all, finding out what these needs are.
Yeah, that does sound about right.
So thank you. Quick follow-up question. What are your thoughts about incentives to participate? So gift cards, iPads, or things like that.
Sure. I mean, my thoughts here are quite complex, really. Don't do it, ever. So
why not?
Well, I mean, from the psychology angle, giving incentives is the worst way to get good quality contributions. I mean, truly, like, giving people incentive, here's what happens. If you give an incentive, people will participate more for a really short period of time, but then they will adapt to whatever that incentive is, and their level of contribution will decline. So there's lots of great books in this, Punished by Rewards, the Dan Ariely books, Predictably Irrational. There's lots of material on this. I mean, the first online community that I ever ran was a video gaming community. We had these volunteers that were running the different groups, and then we got this big sponsorship deal. And we decided with the sponsorship deal, we're going to pay all of the people that are volunteering to manage the groups. The community was dead. Like a few months after that, there were fights, there were conflicts. People tried to game the system. People began attaching their level of work to the amount that they got paid or whatever incentive it is. And this pattern repeats itself throughout so many social situations. So incentives aren't the way to do it. They're not the way to get more people participating. They will work over the very short term, but honestly, the amount of long-term harm that they're doing is not good.
So our next question revolves around the fact that in the international development community, most of our projects have a 5-year lifespan. So what are some strategies that you have seen that are effective, or you yourself have used to continue online engagement after an activity ends if that project featured an online community?
That's a really interesting question. I'm just trying to think of a relevant example. So the question, as I understand it, is they have a community with a fixed lifespan, and it's how to continue that community after the project that's brought them together has completed.
Yes.
Well, I guess the first question is, what's the purpose? Why do you want to keep them together. That would be the first one. The second one is that I hopefully, after working with people for 5 years, that it's relatively easier to bond people into a community, either with a subordinate goal, so a goal that's above that one. But I don't really have a specific way because I don't think it's particularly different from any other situation, really. And I'm sure it is. I'm sure there's lots of unique things about it. I just can't think of the impact that it would have, so I don't have a good answer. I mean, we see, or we occasionally work with communities that are quite transient in their nature. So a travel community where people only visit when they're traveling through that location, or a community via life cycle. So perhaps moms that are just giving birth will participate in a community for a couple of months or weeks, and then they're gone. And it's always being next to impossible to keep these people actively participating. But I'm not sure it's quite relevant to this situation. So I don't think we typically work with communities that have a fixed lifespan. Sorry, I wish I could be of more help.
Okay. So just one final question, Richard, and this is quite a loaded one. It's from Sheila. How many hours per week should a team of 4 dedicate to developing and curating an online community?
So the problem with this question is that the obvious answer is like as many hours as you can. So the more hours that you put into a community, the more you're going to get out of that community. But I know that's the obvious simple answer, and it doesn't help. But I truly believe that. I mean, like, the more time you put into anything you do, the better it's going to be. So I think it's more a case of, and I don't think I've ever worked with someone that got to decide how many hours that they should spend. Usually that amount of time is set by their boss or the other work they have to do. So it's more a case to me of, with the hours that you have, how do you use them most effectively? How do you prioritize what you're going to do with the time you have? And so if you've just launched a community, then, doing a big promotional push probably isn't the best idea. But, directly inviting people to join the community, initiating those discussions, prompting people to respond, that's a really good use of your time. If your community's been going a while, then you want to work on things that affect a lot of members for a long period of time. Things that are going to have the most sustained long-term value in that community. There might be, optimizing the platform. There might be recruiting some volunteers to help. There might be whatever system you're just selling in place to manage that community over the long term. So I would not worry so much. I mean, I guess I would worry, but I don't have an answer for how much time that you should spend, just because my answer is as much as possible. I mean, it's more a case with the time you have and the priorities you have and all the other things that your boss wants you to do. How can you use the time as effectively as possible? And I would focus on those big wins. I'd focus on getting enough people that are actively engaged. And if you have that, getting them to do the kind of things that you need them to do. And using the life cycle that we covered here to decide what tactics you're going to use. And then testing different things, different types of content there, different types of guest interviews, different types of blog posts, different types of events or whatever you have, and seeing what works. We find that some of the things that work in one online community are a disaster in the next, and sometimes we're really surprised. I mean, we're genuinely very surprised by the results. So yeah, I mean, it isn't maybe the answer that you wanted. I think that's 2 bad answers in a row. But I mean, that's kind of the way we look at it. Not how much time you have, but how you use the time you do have. Yeah, I wish I could give a much better answer on that as well.
No, I think you gave some great guidance in that, Rich. Thank you very much. Measuring the effects of our community activities, especially the levels of engagement within our communities, is a challenge for many of us. So it's been really great to hear that even though this might not be the simplest or the most straightforward task, there are things we can do to measure successfully the work that we do at a deeper outcome level and to prove its value in an intentional and quite robust way. So thank you so much for being here with us today. We look forward to hosting you again next Thursday. Before you leave, are there any final words or recommendations you'd like to share?
I wish I had thought of something really smart. No, I mean, when it comes to the data side, it's going to take time to set up the things that you need. It's going to take time to compile the data that you need, set up the systems that you need. but once you have it, it optimizes everything you do. So it's worth taking the week or the days or however long it takes to set up the system first, because it will pay off when you know exactly what to work on, exactly the kind of impression and the influence that you're going to have. So I strongly recommend that. Again, if you go to getvideos.feverbees.com, you can download a bunch of free videos from people that are far smarter than me. And I really hope this session has helped. Thank you so much for having me.
Great, thank you, Rich. And I'd also like to thank our online audience for your participation today. I think it's been a really great session. Before you leave, please take 5 minutes to fill in our online evaluation survey. The link should be on your screens now. And this really does help us to make sure we're meeting your needs with these events. So please take some time to do it. As usual, Rich's presentation, the webinar recording, links to his website, and all the resources we've used today will be uploaded onto the FSN network. Also, please do feel free to continue this discussion on the KM discussion forum on the website. And finally, a reminder that the final session of our 2016 summer series continues next Thursday, 25th August at 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. We'll be joined once again by Rich Millington and also by Stan Garfield, who in our first session last week shared some strategies for building and maintaining communities. We'll also have Dar Maxwell, who is the Manager Learning Technology team at Agility Corp, and she has spent years perfecting the art of engaging global audiences online, so it'll be great to have her on board as well. That session will be a virtual peer assist, so please come prepared with your questions, your challenges, your constraints, for the various aspects of community building and online engagement, and make good use of our guest experts. They'll be here to provide you with some guidance and advice. So we hope to see many of you there then. I think that's it from us. Have a great day. Goodbye.